Good morning and very welcome to Would Be Better. My name is Anna Holmberg. I represent the Swedish forest industries and I have the pleasure of guiding you through the next hour and 30 minutes. But I will not do it on my own. Instead, I am accompanied here in the studio by
Mia Crawford, and I work for the Federation of Swedish Family Forest Owners.
Today's topic is forest monitoring and strategic plans. In other words, the legislative proposal we are expecting from the European Commission later this year. Our focus today will be on the strategic plans, or should I call it integrated long-term forest planning. This is an alternative name that lately has surfaced in the Brussels debate. But independently of what we call it, we will discuss the idea behind such planning and the forest monitoring needed for its purposes. But before we do that, Mia, could you please tell the audience a bit about the Would Be Better network?
Yes, I'll do so. Would Be Better is arranged jointly by the Federation of Swedish Family Forest Owners and the Swedish forest industries. Each network event is hosted by one of these 4 Swedish members of European Parliament that you see on the screen. The network aims to be an arena where we increase the knowledge about forest-based sector and its role in relevant EU decision-making processes.
We are happy that more than 230 of you have signed up for this event, and you come from at least 18 different member states around Europe and also from countries outside of our continent. Thank you for spending part of this Friday together with us. If you are active on Twitter during the event, we would appreciate if you include #WouldBeBetter. And if you want to pose a question, you can do so by logging on to menti.com using the code that you see in front of you on the screen. And don't worry, this code will be repeated several times during the event. When you phrase your question, please respect the KISS principle, meaning keep it short and simple. We would also appreciate if you include your name and affiliation, and we will do our very best to address a selection of these questions towards the end of the event. As usual, we start with a bit of a recap to make sure that we are all somewhat on the same page concerning today's topic. In July 2021, the European Commission presented a revised EU forest strategy. In this document, it is defined that the Commission is to present a legislative proposal on a forest observation, reporting and data collection framework. It is also stipulated that each member state should prepare a strategic plan for its forests, including visions on how these forests and the forest-based sector should develop for the next 10, 30 and 50 years. This is what the timeline looks like. As mentioned, the strategy came in 2021. About a year ago, the Commission ran a call for evidence, and here a revised name occurred, the EU Framework for Forest Monitoring and Strategic Plans, or maybe, as I said before, integrated long-term forest planning. Then, in the fall of last year, there was a public consultation, and later this year we expect the legislative proposal, and according to our latest information, that could be early July, but let's see what we might hear about that timing today. What do we then know about the important elements for this upcoming initiative? Well, by studying what the Commission has stated in documents and in public, here is what Mia and I would say is a non-extensive summary. Concerning the strategic plans, the Commission argues that existing member state plans only address forests in a limited way, and that few member states have strategic documents with a time frame longer than 10 years. The Commission argues that future plans should have the same general structure and contain common elements, but they do not foresee that the plans would be approved by the Commission itself. And concerning forest monitoring, the Commission is stating that today's information is patchy and non-harmonized. that national forest inventories carried out in member states vary in design and update cycles, and this makes it hard to monitor EU policy effects. The Commission states that the EU is the appropriate actor to improve on this situation, and that they would like to see a strong focus on using remote sensing to gather data combined with ground-based monitoring. And last but not least, that this information should be with high spatial granularity.
Well, with this, you have a little bit of background. Now let's bring our host of today's event. Per Holmgren is our host today. He's a member of the European Parliament since the 2019, and he belongs to the Greens. He's a member of the Parliament's ENVI committee and substitute in the TRAN and Agri committees. Per is a well-known TV personality in Sweden, as he previously was a weather presenter for the evening news. But Per is also a singer and an author. Hello, Per. Welcome.
Hello, good morning.
Good morning to you.
Thanks for the presentation.
Yes, I will now give the mic to you. Maybe you will do some singing for us, or at least an opening address. Per, the floor is yours.
Yeah, it's way too early in the morning for some singing. But thank you very much, Mia and Anna. Always a pleasure to see you. I just started my clock, so I will try to remain within 5 minutes. But I'm really happy to be here today and hosting this very important conversation on this EU-wide framework to really coordinate the transition of and improve the knowledge. And I think that is very crucial, to improve the knowledge on the status of what is one of, or maybe even the most important natural resource to mitigate climate change, the decline of biodiversity, and also, of course, ensure the well-being of our societies. Now, as we all know, the majority of forests in Europe today only have medium to low ecosystem integrity, and this is due to human pressures and also unsustainable forest management. And this is so even if countries might have high forest cover. Sweden is a good example, as you mentioned, or as we saw on the video screen, 70% of Sweden is covered with trees. But you could really argue if it's forest or just plantations with monocultural trees, and thus not that high ecosystem integrity that at least me as a Green would like to see. And in Sweden, we're seeing these forest ecosystems being now more or less in a final phase of a total ecological landscape transformation. And this is according to Sweden's own forest agency's latest report, a really negative trend in relation to its national environmental objective for forests. And also, just a few months ago, Finland's Statistical Bureau presented data showing more or less collapse of the carbon sink of Finnish forests. And this is happening while simultaneously world leaders meet and agree that the state of the world's biodiversity is under continuous threat, and also while the world climate scientist community is ever more convinced that we need forests, not only for climate mitigation, but also for climate adaptation. Once again, very clear in the latest report from IPCC. So to me, it's very clear that we at the moment have an agreement at EU level that forest and the forest-based bioeconomy, of course, will be essential in the EU's transition to a climate neutral economy. But however, it has also become clear to me when debating in the parliament or attending events similar to this, and or participating in industry or NGO panel debates, that what this forest-based bioeconomy actually means is yet not really that clear. The questions, of course, are which is the wisest way to use the forest, how much and for what. My guess is we will probably not agree on the answer to those questions today, but still these are very, very central and crucial questions. And for me, it's become more and more obvious that one of the reasons is that we are addressing, when we're discussing the forest, we are addressing it from so many different timescales. If we're looking at a singular tree, a pine in Sweden, the natural timescale is at least close to the order of 1,000 years, when it can still give us different ecosystem services. And if we're looking at a forest in the north of Sweden, then we're talking of about thousands of years. And if we're looking at a forest in Amazon rainforest, then we're talking about millions of years. But at the same time, of course, the forest industry are looking at a much shorter time scale, decades. And I think, as I've often said, that both sides in this debate need to understand and respect the other ones. And for me, being a Swedish Green politician in the European Parliament, I hope to be able to create some sort of bridge when it comes to understand and also addressing the forest in the forest debate, and to address and understand these different. So I'm really looking forward for the rest of this morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Per. I have a short follow-up question to you before we move on in the program. You mentioned about the time scale, and I think this is a very critical element. You know, our forest, especially up here in Sweden, we have, it's a long-term process from small seedling and up until a full-grown tree. It's almost 100 years if you're at least in the north of Sweden. But you politicians, you work on a much shorter time scale. You know, election is coming up in the European Parliament next year. How do you see this conflict here? You know, you want to do short-term results in forest, whereas actually the forest itself takes a long time to grow and develop. What's your reflection on that?
Well, the core reflection is that in politics as well, we do have different timescales. And I think this is a much, much bigger problem for the other political parties. Because for us, being Greens, it's so obvious that we need to address long-term future problems as well. Whereas the other political parties aren't here, so they can defend themselves. But still, from my point of view, they usually are just addressing the short time scale. And then, of course, it will be even more important then to stay within the different mandate periods. But for us as Greens, it's one of the 4 reasons why we exist as a political party, that we want to have the possibility to, yes, do as much good as possible during like this legislation period, but always have this long time period looking ahead as well, and have a clear vision about what we want to see in 50, 100, or even hundreds of years ahead in the future. I think I will return to this kind of discussion later as well.
Thank you very much, Per, for that insight and having that perspective. I think that's it's very critical. And we will return to you towards the end of the event, where you will engage in a short discussion as well. But thank you very much for this opening address. We now move on.
And before I present our first speaker here today, I remind you that you can post questions on menti.com using the code that you see in front of you. So our first speaker, the first intervention today, will come from Mr. Ion Kodesco. Ion works at DG Environment, where he is head of unit for land use and management. And this is the unit which has main responsibility for preparing the legislative proposal we are discussing today. And as many of you probably know, DG Environment is the Directorate General for Environment at the European Commission. Mr. Kodesco is Romanian, but he does have a connection to Sweden. He got his master's degree in European law from the University of Lund in the south of Sweden. So welcome, Ion. How are you today?
Thank you for the invitation. First of all, I think it's an important opportunity for us to engage in this debate also for the reasons that you mentioned, that we are working on this important initiative. I'm fine and I'm happy to be with you today.
Well, we are happy to have you, and we are very eager to hear what you can reveal already today about that upcoming legislative proposal. So we will be all ears. The floor is yours.
Thanks a lot. Well, I will be saying a few things, and probably I should start with what this initiative is not about. And it's not about managing forests. So it's not like Brussels comes with legislation, directive or regulation to intervene and tell member states how to manage forests. I'm saying this because we have had, as you mentioned in the beginning, a lot of debates, and that was one of the key issues which has been brought forward. The same with, because the main topic of today is the planning, the long-term planning. This will not be a plan adopted by Brussels, but it would be a request from Brussels that this kind of debate, which would be crowned with the adoption of a plan, would be done at national level. So it would be for each member state to organize, where it would be a clear request to have this long-term thinking, which is not there. We know that forests play a key role in inter alia in mitigating and adapting to climate change, in preserving and restoring biodiversity, but also in ensuring a strong forest-based bioeconomy. And forested land is by far the main contributor to the EU carbon sink, and will play an essential role in the meeting of EU ambition objective of climate neutrality by 2050. At the same time, the forests provide the raw material for a growing bioeconomy, with the extended forest-based value chains currently supporting about 4.5 million jobs in the EU. And we would like to preserve this also in the long term, but we know that our forests are facing enormous pressure. We all know about the forest fires, which are also linked to the climate change, but not only this kind of diseases which are affecting a lot of forests more and more. And also because of the climatic changes, we see big changes in the type of the forests and trees. So indeed, the forests are increasingly stressed by climate change and human use, and the pressures pose a threat to the capacity of forests to deliver on their different environmental and socio-economic functions. So in order to address these threats, it's crucial to have high quality and comparable data on forests in Europe. And that's the first leg of this initiative you mentioned in the beginning. And we think, and this is what we've done in our impact assessment, to look closely at what we have, what is currently done at EU, but also in the member states. and the monitoring and the planning tools are not fit for purpose. When we look at the various sectors of the economy, the forest sector is the, if you want, the parent pauvre in terms of data monitoring and planning. And well, at this stage, maybe the situation was very different some decades ago. But now we are also we can also take advantage of developments in science, also Earth observation. We have this satellite, LiDAR, and so on, planes, drones, which is a game changer, and we could use this in an integrated manner. And this is a unique opportunity to modernize, digitalize, and harmonize the monitoring of forests, and also provide a service to all forest users and authorities. Maybe very quickly, because I mentioned that we have looked closely, as you know, the Commission is obliged to have an impact assessment on all the legislative initiatives. So we worked a lot on that. It's still to be finalized at this stage. But yeah, so some very interesting data resulted from this. I would not mention necessarily the member states, but I think we can group them in a few categories. There are a few member states who have a lot of forest resources with high economic value, and therefore they have historically invested heavily to see the benefits. Economic policy design, so they have strong monitoring systems. There are others, so second category, which historically have systems which are often based on a more centralized approach, but which are undergoing strong transitions, and they have technological and also methodological challenges. And there is a third category where the monitoring of forest is quite infrequent or became stagnant, or for which no modern inventory or monitoring is taking place. So this gives a very sketchy situation, picture at EU level. So basically, it means that we don't know very well what's the condition of our forests, which are the pressures, and how we can preserve them in the longer run. As I said, there is a group of member states where, I think the Nordic member states are amongst this, where we know a lot. But even there, some functions of the forest, so for example, bioeconomy, forestry, are very well represented by the data. But other functions related to climate, relating to the biodiversity, and also other benefits of forests are not there. So we have a gap in terms of timeliness, temporal frequency, and the survey ranges, which vary much between the member states. We have a gap in terms of completeness, in terms of indicators and geographical coverage, and we also have a gap in terms of harmonization. We don't have the same definition. We are not measuring the same thing, so it's very difficult to compare and have a clear picture at EU level. And because the main topic is the planning, as you mentioned, well, we are still looking into the terminology, but I mentioned already that's not a plan to be adopted, a unique plan at Brussels level, but it should be for the member states. But it's clear that there is a lack of a holistic analysis of the multifunctional dimension of forest in the planning instruments of member states. There are national and regional strategies, programs, plans, but often focused on sectorial policies, and they address the forest from different and distinct, so kind of a silos policy perspectives. This obviously leads to policy fragmentation and incoherence. And also it risks setting targets without considering the several objectives on which forests need to deliver, and could lead to unintended trade-offs and inconsistency. most national planning instruments do not go beyond the 10-year forest planning cycle, and thus they lack a long-term vision, which is needed to support the 2050 objectives under the EU policies. And as we've seen with the climate change and the pressures on the forests, there is a need to have a discussion of how to preserve our forests in the longer run, what we want to get from our forests also in the longer run. As I said, climate and biodiversity and non-timber forest bioeconomy, which are also important. So the forests bring a lot of benefits from this perspective, but unfortunately are often not prioritized in terms of planning. So that's one of our main, let's say, drives behind this part of the proposal, to instigate, to nudge such a discussion in each member state, and to give prominence to these functions of the forests. I think I can leave it at this stage. In terms of timing, because you asked me about the timing, would not be earlier than July. We don't have a clear date for that. As I said, we are still putting the last touches on the impact assessment, and we are working on the legislative proposal as such, which would probably take the form of a regulation. Now, big part of it, so part of it would be strategic planning. Big part of it, the first leg, as I said, it's about monitoring. And there we are working, and it's a technical work because it is about indicators, which should describe all the key functions. So as I said, bioeconomy, which is already quite well represented, but also the other, which are not well monitored at this stage, biodiversity and climate in particular. So we should have indicators for this. But as you imagine, this is rather technical, so we are having a lot of discussions and exchanges with the experts. So that would be for the introduction. Thanks a lot.
Well, thank you so much, Ian. And just a quick follow-up question from our side here. Would you say that Sweden would be in one of those categories that you mentioned that has a comparatively decent monitoring and planning in place, or where would you place Sweden in that set of categories?
Yeah, indeed. It's a country who has thorough monitoring. I think Finland is one other country which has this. Probably it's an important thing to mention, and that was you mentioned the consultations we had, and indeed we have engaged in a lot of consultations. And one clear call to the Commission was that this proposal relies on what is already being done at national level. So indeed, some countries, Sweden is one of them, is well advanced. So we are taking good note, and we are also learning from this experience. And the proposals is built on these examples. Of course, this does not exclude the fact that some harmonization of data, of the pace of monitoring, and so on, are needed. Also, the beefing up of this monitoring of this, how should I call it, new functions of the forest. They are not new, but something which is related to bioeconomy, to biodiversity in particular, and climate, are not so well represented. So we are looking also at indicators for this. So this could be also something to also develop a bit, even for the more advanced member states.
And one additional question, should we continue to call it strategic plans, or is there any other sort of vocabulary that we should connect to?
Well, I think you mentioned already. I think the latest is this EU framework and forest monitoring and strategic plans. But indeed, integrated plan is what we want to achieve.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Ian.
Thank you.
Thank you. And now we will move on to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Kelsey Perman. She works at the NGO Fern in Brussels, where she is a forest and climate campaigner. But I also have found out that you're a devoted soccer fan, I believe, and that you have perhaps even been a sport envoy for the US State Department. Is that right, Kelsey?
Yes, that's true. You've done your research.
That's great. We're huge soccer fans here in Sweden as well, as you know. So looking forward to hear your perspective on this. Perhaps you have some free kicks for us.
Yes, thank you very much for the invitation. It's a very important topic, and I think the biggest question that I hear raised in the debate is, what problem are we solving? So I'd like to spend a little bit of time hopefully making that bridge that Par was mentioning in the beginning about addressing the impacts on forests and addressing the impacts on foresters and the benefits of planning in that process. So in my organization, we compile information from national NGOs, forest protection groups. We're also looking a lot at information from research organizations. We work with universities, and we're also working with many foresters. So I want to give a snapshot of the types of information that we receive from different countries that show why forest monitoring, particularly at the European level, has a clear added value, and why we're not yet there in terms of planning at the national level. So we have a newsletter that we compile every year, and we have case studies that come through that show that the track record of stopping destruction in the most precious forest that we have left is poor. We have examples from Finland and Estonia, Poland and Romania, and we also have examples from Sweden as well. But if I was to give a very concrete example as to why monitoring is so important, I would refer to an example that maybe many of you have seen, a very in-depth New York Times article that was showing loggers harvesting trees from protected areas in Romania. So this was compiled through the work of investigative journalists, NGOs like Euronatur and Agent Green and the Environmental Investigation Agency. They basically needed to track the wood as it was loaded into trucks. It took a year to compile that assessment, and it used a combination of Google Earth satellite imagery and on-the-ground tracking. So coming back to this question of, do we need satellite or on the ground? We clearly need both to see exactly what's happening. And in the context of all of this, we have less than 3% of these very highly valuable forests. And if we have to keep proving the destruction in this way, where it takes a year for every case study, then we're not going to get very far. We really need regulation to come in at a certain stage to be able to protect what's left. Another example, in Estonia, the national audit body there was looking at the impacts of logging in protected areas. And there was a handful of interesting information that came out. It revealed that logging permits for protected areas were often issued without regard for their impact on conservation goals. But as it relates to the monitoring issue, what I found interesting is that they found little to no information was collected about the protected areas. So their precise size, the actual amount of the logging that occurs in them. And it was actually revealed in certain cases that Natura 2000 subsidies were being given out when the forest was no longer there. That should not be the case. If we look at Sweden and Finland, as we mentioned, there are these claims that they do have a detailed monitoring system, but it's about how that's being used for planning. So if you think about alerts that have been raised earlier this year about logging and high conservation value forests in both of these countries, once again, the mapping of these areas and the flagging of when something is going wrong, that often falls to NGO groups like Greenpeace or Protect the Forest. And then there's a question of, why can governments not plan in this area? So of its own initiative, the Swedish government abandoned the national inventory of high conservation value forests using a very well-established method where we could have information, the woodland key habitat approach. So where there might be information and there might be monitoring, it's not being integrated into a way where we can plan to avoid the worst impacts in forests. So what am I saying by all of this? Most of the issues need to be flagged by NGOs. Some of these NGOs are having problems having their cases heard in court. So despite the data being around, it's not being used properly. And so this is the benefit of having third-party evaluation and then being able to plan to make sure that we meet climate and biodiversity as well as the industry goals. It enhances the trustworthiness. But so in most of these cases, we're talking about the impacts of large logging companies. So these are the largest private and the public forest owners. But these groups are very different actors than the small forest owners. So in Sweden, I think it's about 1/3 of the forest owners that own less than 5 hectares. this is a very different group of people who need significantly more help with planning. So most of my friends that own forests that need help cutting down their trees tell me that it's quite hard to find contractors that can promote alternative management practices other than sort of the even-aged forestry with clear cutting, regardless of the forest owner's own objectives for their forest. So this occurs despite the fact that there is an interest in alternative forest monitoring methods, which I find very interesting. So there's a question: how can monitoring help these foresters find back a freedom to do something different and express the diversity of the practices that exist on land? And I think that's a very interesting question. I think one of the best parallels is under the Common Agricultural Policy, where we do speak of strategic plans. And we also see benefits of around 7 million farmers that are receiving area-based payments. I definitely don't say they're perfect. There's plenty of critiques to be given to the Common Agricultural Policy. But the point that I want to make is that money is given for certain practices, and those checks are usually done through a combination of ground truthing and using the satellite data. And what is the added value of doing a planning like that? It can improve the forester's position in the value chain. So it can reward their ecological outcomes. This is done by monitoring what's happening on the ground. More generally, I think that monitoring can help forest owners plan in a way that larger companies can plan. So I think we already know very big companies can do forest health assessments and they can monitor what needs to happen over the next couple of years. But detecting early warning of pest outbreaks and droughts, your average small forester doesn't have access to that information very easily. And it's it's an argument to say that it should be a public service that's provided transparent, publicly available information so that a forester can be able to dictate the type of practice that it wants, and a small forester can put themselves on the same level as a very big company that's having a very different impact. So all of this to say that I think the majority of forest owners across Europe and the forests themselves stand to benefit quite a lot from increased monitoring. And I would actually question the arguments that are saying that we're doing enough already because of all of the examples that I've given. Clearly, the right information isn't getting to the right people to pursue the types of activities that we've set out under the European Green Deal. So we have snapshots, but we're missing sort of trends in planning over time. We shouldn't have to wait 5 years to find out we've been headed in the wrong direction, the foresters have been poorly paid, and the last remaining biodiversity is disappearing. So we need to use that information and eventually plan to be able to achieve those sustainability outcomes that we want. And I think this is the central added value of the monitoring proposal and of the planning that accompanies it.
Yes, thank you so much, Kelsey. I have some follow-up questions. So you mentioned a couple of examples here in your presentations of ill practices, and perhaps that is, there are various different national examples that you were given. To what extent do you think European legislation would actually address those issues when it's in fact issues that should be addressed maybe more at the national level? I mean, you can consider it's a lack of national legislation that is not put in place, or national practices. So that's one thing. And then you also made a connection to the strategic plans in the Common Agriculture Policies. Should we take it that you are actually advocating for a common EU policy on forestry as well?
So I'll maybe take the last one first. I mean, I think we already have a variety of policies on forest, and I wouldn't advocate taking the same approach as we've done in the agriculture sector. But I think that there are similar objectives that we're trying to reach, and through things like the LULUCF legislation and the nature restoration law, these are setting out objectives in a different way. And I think that the utility and the necessity of the planning is the fact that frequently when we take all of these individual policies on their own, we find that the reports and the data that we get often don't add up. And so this is the benefit of sort of third-party auditing. And I think most forest owners understand the concepts. Third-party auditing is necessary for access to things like the Forest Stewardship Council or other types of certification bodies. And so there's an added value to be able to reflect transparent information in situations where nationally there might be sort of conflict resolution that needs to happen around certain activities. So I think that's the benefit of having an outside actor be able to standardize and level the playing field for foresters across the board and be clear where certain objectives are not being met. So it's definitely not an argument to replicate the cap. I think there's a lot to be argued for serious reform of that system. But I think here we're having a discussion about how can we do that better in the forestry sector. And so I definitely think that is helped by additional planning to bring clarity to a situation of monitoring where there is often a very heated and involved debate.
Okay, and maybe you could just respond to, so do we want to fix national problems by EU policy? Is EU legislation? That was sort of my first part. You know, you gave a couple of examples where we can see that there has been some ill practices in the forest, and that's really, why do we need to fix that? Why, and what could EU do better than what we can do at the national level?
Mm-hmm. So, I think we see already we needed to set out climate legislation because it was a transboundary problem. And we had references earlier about the fact that we're seeing think in a lot of different countries. And so this is the added value of the European Union to come in with some responses to problems in environmental legislation that touch on all countries, despite small differences in the way that we operate in different biomes. So, I think we've already seen that there's a need for the EU to come in and be able to, as I see it, bring in diversity in terms of promoting different management practices, providing useful information, and creating new opportunities to value the environment in different ways. So I definitely see an added value for EU action through this policy and through the other ones that exist already.
Okay, thank you, Kelsey. Well, you mentioned a lot on forest owners and the need for planning at the forest management level and by forest owners. We are very lucky that our next speaker is a forest owner, and I'll hand over to you, Anna.
Well, thank you very much. As mentioned, our next speaker is Marie Wickberg. Marie is Director of Sustainability at Mellanskog, which is the second largest forest owner association in Sweden with some 27,000 members. Marie is from the region of Värmland in the western parts of Sweden, and in case you wouldn't know, that is an area which definitely has a lot of forest resources. Marie is also a forest owner herself, and I believe that she will show us hands-on the sort of planning process that she has in place for her forest holdings. So Marie, you are very welcome to the event, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Anna. It's a pleasure to be here today. I have a few slides that I want to show you, so I hope the technique will work. Oh, that's great. As you said, Mellanskog is a forest owners association. We represent about 27,000 members. We have 240 employees and have a yearly turnover of about 400 million euros. We can take next slide. This is a little picture from my own property with my 2 kids and my dog. And I would like to start by giving you a brief overview of the data that's currently easily and publicly available on my own small plot of land, which is about 40 hectares in the Midlands of Sweden. I can take the next slide. So this was the oldest map that I could find online via the National Land Survey in Sweden. This map is from 1646 and it shows my property. At this time, most of the land was pasture land and there were small plots of arable land. I think this map is amazing. You can even see the small pictures of houses that someone has been drawing. But this was easily available for me online. And you can take the next slide. We'll make a time jump to 1960. This is the same place. And then you can take the next slide, which is another time jump to 1975. And for me, as the houses that you see here, that's where I grew up. And to me, this is very interesting to see how the forest landscape is changing over the decades. And if you take the next slide, we go back to the present. This is how my property looks today. You can see it's named Kisterud 1.9. This is public data showing property boundaries publicly available for every part of Sweden from the National Land Survey. And if you take the next slide, this is some of the tools that I use as a small forest owner in Sweden. Owning 40 hectares is less than the average property in Sweden. You can see that my decision making is based on a combination of remote sensing data and field inventories. If you look to the left, that's my own forest management plan, which is largely based on field inventories. The next picture to the right is a data layer showing the risk of watery grounds, which is made, I guess, based on AI technology. And the next picture is showing tree height, which is basically showing the age of my forest. And as you can see, I do not have a lot of old growth forest on my property. The next picture is findings of species. It's probably quite small for you, but you can see small dots on the pictures. That's a finding of a bird of prey that someone, maybe my neighbor or someone walking around in my forest has made. And there's also findings from the Bronze Age, which is marked in this map. And these inventories are made by the public or the forest owners or authorities. And they are, as I said, available for me to use in my forest planning. For example, I'm preparing to do a forest operation in the area where I have the findings from the Bronze Age. So this was very helpful to me to plan my activities in my own forest. And we can jump to the next slide. This is some key takeaways, and some of it has been addressed by both Kelsey and Ion earlier. We have about 300,000 private forest owners in Sweden, and they own about 50% of the Swedish forests. And from a Swedish perspective, there's no lack of data on a property level. And I would also say that the rapid development of laser scanning, harvest data, and AI has helped presenting data for forest owners and decision makers. But this, I think, needs to be combined with field inventories. And in Sweden, our Rikskogstaxering celebrates its 100th birthday this year. So this is something that we've been doing in Sweden for a very long time. I think also a key takeaway is that forest is national competence. And I think the principle of subsidiarity needs to be fully respected. I see little relevance in EU actions to monitor forest resources on a detailed forest management level, but I think Ian had some interesting remarks on this, which I guess will be discussed later on. I see that EU could play a valuable role in collecting and gathering existing forest-related data and information as a one-stop shop. I think also Kelsey had some interesting points in making this data available for the forest owners to create good decision-making in the forest. I think that's an important point. And I also think that consistent data and common principle for data registration is crucial, to know that we are comparing the same things and that we also can analyze the outcome of different forest policies in a good way. I think also EU could play a role in enhancing the capacity building in collection and reporting of data, both in EU and abroad. And I think, which Ian also touched on, but that on a national level, I think strategic plans could be useful if they focus on policy coherence and also, as we heard earlier, on the long-term perspective, which is, of course, useful. But I think also they should be voluntary, and I think it's crucial that they are on a national level, not on the property level. So this was a brief summary of some key takeaways from me, and also some of the data that I could easily find online for my own property, just to make an example of what is actually there in Sweden today.
Well, thank you very much, Marie. Of course, I have a few quick questions to you. First of all, we heard Ian say before that we need maybe the not very traditional type of data for forests relating to climate, to biodiversity, to non-timber services. To what extent would you say that you have that sort of data available already today?
Well, I think that Ian is right that there's traditionally more data related to the economic activities, but I would say that there are some data, for example, findings from the Bronze Age in the forest, or findings of different species, or adaptation to climate change. I think this development has been moving quite fast in the last couple of years. But of course, I think there's a good knowledge about the forest and a good knowledge about what I own and what I have to develop for future generation is always a good thing. But then the question is, how do we use this data, and how do we create policy from this data? And that's another debate, I think.
Well, that actually leads me to my second follow-up question. So thank you for that, creating that bridge. Because you mentioned that strategic plans, and now you also spoken about data, should not sort of be down on a property level. Could you sort of expand a bit and explain why that is an important argument for you?
Well, I think a strength in the Swedish perspective is that the 300,000 Swedish forest owners, they have very different individual strategies. And as Kelsey also mentioned, some of them want to have alternative methods for managing their forests, and today that is possible. But maybe we have a lack of knowledge in forest owners associations and in forest companies to help the forest owners. But I think the perspective of having them or letting them have different strategies is very important to create diversity. And I think this is a strength from a Swedish perspective.
Okay, interesting, because you brought forward the argument of diversity. I thought that you would perhaps say something about, I own my forest. If anyone can see all the data for that forest, I would feel that my ownership rights had been intruded. Or are you quite comfortable on that note?
Well, I think today, of course, there is a debate in Sweden going on how much data should actually be public. But today, almost all the data that I showed you is easily available. And I don't think that's the big issue. I think the dialogue between different actors within the forest sector is a bigger issue to be solved.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you for that intervention, Marie. It's time for us now to move on to our moderated discussion. Before we do so, I remind you once again that you can post questions on menti.com using the code that you will see in front of you on the screen. And for the moderated discussion, Mia and I have prepared several topics. On each one of them, we will start by making an argument, which the panelists can then choose to react on in whatever way they would like to. So that's the sort of setup. So let's bring our speakers back into the panel so we can all see you on the screen. Excellent. Technology is working. That makes it much easier to be a moderator. So Mia, I leave the first one to you.
Thank you, Anna. And when we were planning this event, we wanted to focus on the strategic plans. So that's the first topic. I would argue that it's important to thoroughly discuss the purpose and the value of the strategic plans. And to be really explicit, we've already heard different views here on at what level we need these strategic plans. And so I would argue that we really need to be clear on what level do we need strategic plans, if we need them at all. So Marie, I will start with you. So you were very clear that strategic planning is not needed at the forest management level. I would ask you a little bit to elaborate more on what level do you see possible a need for strategic planning?
Well, thank you for the question. I think there is an added value for strategic planning on the national level. For example, as I mentioned earlier, linked to to policy coherence. I think that could be an important perspective. But I also like to stress that this is something that is actually already done in a lot of countries in Europe, for example, through the national forest programs. And I think that it's an important platform to hold on to and to build on the things that are already done and which are working today. They could be developed, of course, but I think also it's a good platform for discussion. From a forest owner's perspective, I think the long-term planning is important from a climate change perspective. 50% of our members say this is their top priority when we ask them what they want us to prioritize in the coming years. So a long-term planning in a climate change perspective, I think could be an added value also. And last, I'd like to stress also the consequences. I think something that we often leave out is what consequences do different strategies have for our society or for individual forest owners. So I think this is also an important perspective to have in the when you talk about strategic planning, to analyze the consequences. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Marie.
Yes.
Yeah, we had some technical issues, but now she's back.
I'm back with you. Thank you so much, Marie. Well, Kelsey, I understood that you were actually thinking that this would be useful to have strategic plans for the forest management level. Can you, so we have, so Marie was saying, not at the forest management level, national level is where we should do the strategic plans. And in fact, we already have existing strategic planning already in place, so perhaps we don't really need the EU perspective here. That's my take on your message, Marie. So Kelsey, you were going in another direction. It's at this forest management level. Can you elaborate?
Yes. Sure. So information is useful at different levels. And I think the conversation that I was alluding to in my presentation is what are the types of objectives that we find important. Sorry, I'm hearing some noise in the background. I don't know if somebody doesn't have their microphone muted. Sorry. So yeah, we are trying to respond to different issues currently that already implicate the forest management planning level. So if we think about trying to reward carbon removals in the land use change and forestry sector, there we're already talking about how can we get a forester to adopt the right types of activities, and that would necessitate verification at the plot level as we do with agriculture. we're currently talking about trying to encourage restoration activities, which are also happening at a local level and will need to be monitored. And so these necessitate planning obligations to be able to do this. And so for me, it's an evidence then that the European level planning to achieve European level objectives that are trying to reward individual foresters needs to have a monitoring at the plot level as well.
Okay, well, thank you. We really see that there are some differences here. So I will now turn to you, Ian. So we've heard different views, what we really need, these strategic levels. So what's the plan from the Commission?
Well, as I said, we looked into this thoroughly. We also had a lot of consultations, also had this public consultation. So there seems to be a lot of support for this kind of strategic planning. But our assessment shows that, well, if we take the timeliness of this, very few member states, in fact, only two, I think Germany and Austria, have national strategies exceeding a 10-year cycle. So 10 years for the life of the forest, we know how much time is needed for a tree to grow, is not too much. So that's one of our ideas, to have this longer term, so longer, I mean, I mentioned more than 10 years, 30, 50 years thinking, reflection on what are the pressures on the forests, how they should be developing. And then a second element, which is extremely important, I think was mentioned also by Kelsey and to a certain extent by Marie, is this multifunctional dimension, which is also lacking. Is what we have is either focus on forestry related issues in terms of planning, or we have other types of instruments, other plans looking at the climate perspective, but not putting all things together. And I think this is what is lacking, this integrated approach, this, looking at the ecosystem of forests with all the pressures, all the risks, but also all the benefits. And replying to the question, I mean, actually, I think we can resume this with a word. We don't have a vision, a long-term vision for the forests. What do we want from them? What do we want to have there in the longer run? On the level, we agree. I mean, what we would be interested in is first of all the national level. So it is strategic planning, so it should be at a certain level of generality, but it would rely first of all on the monitoring data. So if we don't have monitoring data representing all these functions, we can't have strategic thinking. And this should come, bottom up. And then, of course, there should be some kind of thinking also at lower level. We wouldn't be necessarily interested in that. But of course, if you have some national thinking, you might want to listen to the stakeholders, to the forest owners, and so on. So on this basis, you would build at national level this kind of longer-term strategy. And also, once you have it, you would have some effects, some kind of cascading effects at local level to see how various things which are in the strategy apply. For example, you would have various models of developing a forest with certain consequences on that. So that would be very useful, I would think for the forest owners or managers, because they would know much more, what's to be expected in terms of pests, in terms of climate change, of type of trees, which might change in 30, 50 years' time, what would be the impact on their forest. And from there, they could also be empowered to, have better knowledge in order to take some decisions in terms of how should I manage or not. What model should I choose? Should I touch more or less on certain aspects? Thanks.
Well, thank you, Ian. So I at least heard, maybe that's wishful thinking, that the strategic plans should be at the national level, but they should be developed through a bottom-up process where you involve forest owners and other stakeholders. So that's that's an interesting discussion here we're having. And so we will now move on to
let's
the next.
continue to talk a little bit more about the strategic plans. And this time, you have already touched on it, but let's dive a bit into what should they actually contain. Because here I can see different alternatives. It could be, begin by keeping it simple with few elements and at an aggregated level and build over time. Or we could see an alternative where the upcoming legislation is quite specific already from the beginning. So I'd like to see where you stand on this sort of a scale, if you understand what I mean. And I think I'll go to you, Kelsey, first. You have touched on some of the elements that you would like to see in strategic plans, but could you sort of repeat and extend your wording a bit on that, please?
Sure. So I think coming back to the issue of how do we ensure that there is coherence in the objectives that are being laid out. That means it's important to take a variety of plans that are usually issued on the national level. Some countries have biomass development plans. There are requirements under national energy and climate plans to show how you think that your forest sink and your land sink is going to evolve over time. And in talking with some national groups, many times when you put these plans next to each other, they don't make a lot of sense. So I think there's something to be said about being able to drill down and to see, since there usually is some reflection on forest planning, to what extent actions that are being taken in the forest sector work together synergistically to achieve these various objectives, or is one overpowering another? Which could explain the sort of biodiversity crisis that we're facing currently. So it allows, I would see a utility in being able to bring together the various and sometimes contradictory information that we're seeing in plans that focus solely on production, or assessments that are mainly looking at environmental elements but are inadequate. Being able to bring that together to see if the strategies that we're undertaking actually make sense would be valuable.
Good, excellent. So you're actually bringing in the sort of need for some policy coherence to make sure that the arrows are pointing in the same direction instead of perhaps being in contradictory directions. Interesting. Marie, when you listen to Kelsey, what's your thinking on this? Do you have a different or a similar view on what the elements, what does actually have to be in these strategic plans?
Well, I agree about the perspective of policy coherence, but I also think that I think the bottom-up perspective is very important. And I think that if you look at different countries in the European Union, I think their vision or their goals for their own forests might look a little bit different. So I think you need to start with the national vision. What's the aim for our forest policies? What's the goal with our Swedish forests or the German forests? So I think the bottom-up perspective is crucial, and also that we can allow differences in the strategic plans for different countries. And I also think that we need a focus in the plans for how we can create drivers for the development that we want to see. For example, from a Swedish perspective, this might mean spreading knowledge about how to create robust forests that will meet climate change, and spread the knowledge to forest owners, but also improving growth, which is also crucial from a climate change perspective, improved plant materials, for example. But I think from a Swedish perspective, also ensuring the unique right to public access that we have in Sweden, I think that could be an important perspective for a national strategic plan. Also ensuring a long-term perspective for the forest research agenda, which is also crucial for the forest industries in Sweden. So that might be some elements that could be crucial for a Swedish national plan. And of course, ensuring biodiversity is also, of course, a key element. But I think there's more to it than climate change and biodiversity. That's important, I think.
Okay, good. Thank you. So, Ian, I think you're almost going to have to take the moon down with this legislative proposal. It's going to include a long-term vision for 10, 30, 50 years. It's going to be a bottom-up process, sort of have the national view. How are you going to achieve this? What sort of a design of EU legislation can we anticipate here?
Well, in terms of EU legislation, and we heard the calls on subsidiarity, so leaving enough room and flexibility to the member states, it would be easy because there will be a requirement for having this kind of strategic planning, and probably some kind of common elements or requirements for these plans, but at a high level of generality. So the bulk of work would be at national level to do that. Of course, we would. That would be for the bigger requirements, but we don't want to stay away from if any support is needed in terms of guidance, putting facilitating the exchanges between member states. We can also contribute to this, but the work would need to be done at the national level. And I think I mentioned already, Marie picked up as well. Bottom-up approach is important for such a strategic planning. It need a democratic process so that all the views are heard. Well, what the plan should contain, it should contain the kind of the baseline, the condition of the forests from an ecosystem perspective. And as I said, whereas the information is better in certain member states, in others is totally lacking. So we don't know exactly what's the condition of this. In some regions of Europe, I think Kelsey mentioned this, we have still big issues of illegal logging in some regions. Some kind of 20 to 25% of the logging is done illegally, which is very worrying, of course. So we should also have data about this, and it should lie at the bottom. I mean, if you have such a reality, it should be reflected in the integrated planning, so that we can also take measures to address this. So the condition, the risks, the pressures, also in terms of climate and so on. Also the opportunity and, the targets, the vision for the future. What do we want to achieve? How do we want to preserve? What do we want to draw in terms of benefits from the forests?
Well, thank you very much. I think that, at least for me, made it a little bit clearer what we can expect. So over to you, Mia.
Thank you. And this legislation will not only focus on strategic plans, even though we have in the debate here discussed mostly that. It's also about monitoring. And Ian, you just mentioned that one critical element in a strategic plan will be this baseline of data. So let's move now to monitoring and see what kind of data we need. Is it on the ground inventories generated data, or is it remote sensing? And I would argue that from a Swedish perspective, we have long experience of working on the ground data. And this is by far the best way to generate data. I would even go as far as issue a strong warning against relying too much on remote sensing. And so let's debate that issue for a little while. And maybe I go to you, Marie, first. You showed in your presentation that you are using a little bit of both, actually. So would you like to discuss the pros and cons here about on-the-ground data and remote sensing, and what's your view?
Well, I agree with you, Mia. I think this is using both is crucial. Well, from a forest owner's perspective, as I pointed out earlier, I use both in my decision making. I use satellite data and I use AI to analyze risk and to make long-term decisions. for example, how climate change will impact on my property, or maybe where the highest risk of bark beetle might be. That's some examples of where I use satellite data. But I also strongly believe that national field inventories is a key factor also in the future. It's only when you have your feet on the ground that you can spot a rare flower or realize that this specific place might be better suited for pine than for a spruce. And I also think that if we want to keep this small-scale forest planning that is so crucial for diversity, then I think field inventories is crucial to create these very small-scale diverse management plans. So I think that a combination of both is important and will be important in the future, even with developments of satellite data and AI. You can't really rule out one or another.
Thank you, Marie. So I move over to you, Kelsey. What camp are you in? Are you in the remote sensing and relying more on that because that will at least provide data for maybe countries who don't really have on-the-ground data? So are you more leaning towards that, or are you also in the same category than Marie, that we need a bit of both?
Yeah, so I think in the example that I gave in being able to map out the situation in Romania, that used a mix of both of those elements. I've heard a lot of criticism about the use of satellite data. I think it's because there is a lot of work on making sure that the algorithms to process what we're seeing actually gives us accurate information. But I think the same thing can be leveraged on sort of the field surveys as well. If you don't have the right person in the forest, they won't see the beautiful rare flower or nest of a rare species that Marie was alluding to. They might only see the cost of all of the timber that's standing in their forest. So there's a necessity to be able to identify what are the right things to look at in the sky and on the ground, so that we have a good assessment of the resilience and the health of the forest that we're looking at. And we need to have the right people with the right expertise looking at that satellite data and doing the field surveys. So I think I agree that both are critically essential to be able to create a right picture, and that there's a deeper question of what exactly should we be looking at, and whose expertise should we be bringing to the table to be able to create that clearer picture. I think, as I mentioned, with the woodland key habitats no longer being tracked, we probably need, in addition to the forest engineers that can have a lot of expertise, biologists that understand the ecology much more than your average forester. Let's say. I of course speak with a lot of forest engineers that have a lot of expertise, but I would say that they are rare in the discussion, and there's a lot of capacity building that's needed and expertise from other people that also know the forest quite well to be able to create this globe of the reality of forests.
Thank you both. So it seemed to be at least an agreement here that we need a bit of both. And then I turn to you, Ian. So having a bit of both, you could potentially, it will cost a lot of money to build the capacity to do the on-the-ground field inventories, at the same time also having these remote sensing mechanisms in place. So would you elaborate a little bit about the cost involved in this, and who's going to pay for this, all of this?
Well, thank you, Mia. See that you assume I agree also with this mix between the two, and indeed you're right. There are certain indicators for certain functions of the forests which can be drawn by remote sensing, but others only by field survey. Sometimes, however, it is important also to overlay this type of data and to cross-check. So that's something important. Then another aspect I wanted to mention is that in the initiative, we are thinking of allowing the member states who have this type of data to use it, both ground level, but also remote sensing. To use what we call an opt-in option. So even if we were to develop, and that's, I come immediately to this point, at EU level, certain data, those who have already developed systems, they could use this kind of data. Some harmonization, however, might be useful and needed in order to be able to compare, to speak about the same things for all member states, and then to put together this data. Well, as you mentioned, there will be certain costs. We see also a lot of, and of course, the Commission cannot help too much as regards, on the ground work. This would need to be developed in certain member states. I think only 2 of them do not have this NFI services, but the rest do. So a lot of work is already done. People are already in the field. They might need additional training for gathering data which has not been so far gathered. But this kind of one-off costs could be avoided in for a lot of countries. So that's something important to take into account. As regards remote sensing, we are thinking of developing some services to the member states by the Commission. So also taking into account the administrative costs for that, and offer to the countries who would like to use that, whereas others who have this data could use their own data. So we have looked into the figures in the impact assessment, and we are also this would be made public at the moment when we publish the proposal, when this is adopted. As I said, the Commission is working also on developing this kind of services, so that we can support the member states who are in need of this.
Okay, thank you, Ian. We're really looking forward to read the impact assessment also on the cost aspects as well as everything else. I think we now will see if we have some questions from the audience.
Let's bring in some questions from the audience. So I have one here, and then you can do a bit of a check over on your side while I speak. So this one is addressed to Ian, and I think it's more of a question where the person who has filed the question really wants to understand. So will it be compulsory for member states to issue strategic plans under this legislation, but the Commission will not approve the plans, or will it actually be voluntary to file plans? Could you just shortly elaborate on that shortly, please, so we can bring in some more questions as well?
Sure. Yes, the plans would be obligatory, so they will need to be developed at the member state level. But the Commission would not approve the plans. We might issue look at the plans, issue some recommendations, which would be not obligatory for the member states, as we do for other types of legislation. But that would be all. But it is important to have this strategic thinking at national level in each country. So without such a requirement, this would not be developed by everybody.
Okay, good, thank you. That clarified things.
Yes, I do have another question, and it's to you as well, Ian. And it's there is already a lot of forest monitoring existing at the global level, to the UN, but also at the regional level, Forest Europe, for instance. So what would be the relationship to these monitoring systems? And if we already have them, do we really then need to, shouldn't we build on those, was the question.
Yeah, indeed. We are looking to use the FISE system. Some data is gathered based on some existing requirements in other pieces of legislation at EU level. Others come from what we call international commitments. So we'll be building on this. But Other data is not there. I mean, I didn't give you figures, but for example, data on tree species diversity, which is essential in terms of knowing the forest resilience, is only reported by 20 member states, and that's something critical and should have been developed already. 18 member states report data on annual increment and forests and felling. So that's kind of obvious data. So you see it's not covered by everybody. But when it comes to what I was saying, less kind of common functions, at least so far, biodiversity. So the diversity of non-tree plant species, only 5 countries are doing this. So we see a lot of scope of also developing, but indeed what's already there should be used. So we try to avoid as much as possible applications and costs, obviously.
Okay, we might have time for one more question. And we have one here from the audience, and it's more on this, how Commission and how the EU can help, and possibly also how forest owners and how NGOs could actually help in the forest monitoring. What support is needed in to do the data collection, and maybe you can all give a quick answer. So I start with Marie. What kind of support do you need in the forest monitoring at the more from a forest owner perspective, and then we move on from there.
Well, from a forest owner's perspective, I think the availability of the data is crucial. It needs to be easily accessible and easy to find. But I also like to stress that I think an important perspective is to make the data coherent and to report in the same way from different EU states. In that way, we can more easily evaluate how different policy strategies work in different countries, and I think that could be a useful perspective to make the reporting more similar. Will make it easier to draw conclusions. So I think that could be something to work on.
And then if I may suggest, I have a good quick question for Kelsey here, because then we've addressed one to each. So this one is for you, Kelsey. You mentioned that you think improved data could make it easier for smaller forest owners to sort of do better forest management. So the question is, if you could just explain a little bit more of your thinking on that.
Yes, I think I can weave it into also responding a bit to the last question that was there. I mean, all of us, whether we're foresters or NGOs, we need relevant information to be able to improve ecosystems outcomes. So, I mean, currently easily publicly accessible information on biodiversity, we have it partially over 25% of forests that are covered with the birds and habitats reporting. And then, as I mentioned in one of my case examples, even there, sometimes we're not understanding what degradation looks like. And then we have to rely on punctual studies that come out every 5 years to tell us that resilience is declining. So I think to translate that over to the forest owner, not every forest owner understands how to use a martelloscope to be able to, think about the environmental selection criteria of certain logs. We need very clear, understandable information about the fact that there may be a resilience risk in a monoculture plantation that a forester has. It may be under risk of drought, depending on what the season looks like. And that type of information, the very smart people among us can spend the hours digging, or the very tenacious NGOs can spend the year putting together the information. But that's not adequate enough for planning in a world that's changing very quickly.
Oh, well, thank you. That was very sort of clearly understandable examples. So thank you to all three of you for your interventions and for your participation in this moderated debate. It's now time for us to turn back to our host today, Per Holmgren. So I'm going to say, hello, Per, are you still there? And the control room is telling me that he is there. Good. We're just going to make sure we can see you on the screen from the control room as well. So just bear with us a few seconds.
No, I think I can be seen and heard.
many events, they run into a few technical. There we go.
I think everything is working fine now.
Perfectly. Yeah. So, Per, you've listened to the interventions, you listened to the debate. What would you say? Are there a lot of divergences, or do the different stakeholders, are they more or less heading in the same direction? What's your impression?
Yeah, I mean, of course, there are differences and divergences, but I really think we need to focus on the similarities as well. I don't find the English word, but in Swedish, I usually talk about that we need to get out of the skyttegravarna. Is it called ditches in English? We really need to be better at talking to each other. And as I stated in my introductory statement as well, we need to have a better and more clear vision about the future of our forest. And I'm not talking then only about 10, 30, 50 years from now, but actually hundreds of years from now. What kind of forests do we want to see in the real future? And then start planning for that from now. And this is, as I see it, a huge problem in politics generally, that most of the other political parties are only defending the old paradigm, everything that we used to do in the 20th century. And yes, they can think about maybe changes a few details, but I really think we need a clear vision about how to create a fully sustainable society. And that, of course, includes forestry. As Ian said, we need to look at the risks, but also at all the benefits that we can find in the forestry. And some of you mentioned the cost of this transition with more monitoring, etc., etc. But then we need to understand that the market today is prepared to pay in the order of 10 times more for artificial high technical solutions when it comes to carbon sinks and negative emissions, 10 times more than the value of a full forest when it's clear cut and delivered. If we only looking at the value of the carbon sink. I mean, from a forest, we do not only get the value of the carbon sink, we get a lot of other values as well. That is, to me, the forest owners should be paid so much, much, much more than they are today. And this is, I think, a good example of what I also said in the introduction, that we need to create this bridge to fully understand the climate emergency situation that we have, and also the emergency when it comes to loss of biodiversity. And we need to address that ecological catastrophe that we're heading into, but we also need to find solutions, financial, economical solutions for the forest owners that are really beneficial for all of those many, probably hundreds of thousands of forest owners only in Sweden and Finland that really want to see a forestry where we work together with the ecosystem services and not, as we unfortunately often do today, more or less fight against the nature-based solutions. But the most important thing for me during this discussion, listening to Kelsey and Marie and Ian, is, after all, that there are a lot of similarities. And I think we need to focus on the similarities and together then create this vision about how do we want to create a fully sustainable forestry with fully sustainable forests for not only the short-term future, but also for the long-term future. That's the most important things for me.
Well, that sounds interesting indeed. Maybe not the easiest thing to achieve, but thank you so much for bringing us all back to a bit of that helicopter perspective here at the end, because I think we need that in quite often in the EU policy debate to sort of lift our heads and have a bit more of that helicopter perspective. So thank you, Per.
Thank you, Anna.
Over to you, Mia.
Yes, ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the end of this event. I hope that you have learned a lot of things and that you have found the discussions very interesting. We certainly have. And thank you so much for participating.
Take care. Have a nice weekend once you get there, and we look forward to welcome you to our next Would Be Better event. That will most likely be in the early fall. So keep an eye open in your inboxes and have a good weekend. Thank you and bye-bye.